Okay. Well, there probably won't be anybody listening because everyone's listening to the other link. But I'm going to rave on for a moment and give an abridged version because we are a little late. I'm sorry that the other one didn't work. I have no idea what happened. The stream seemed to drop out very early, and I can't see any problem my end with that, but there has obviously been a problem. So I'm going to just rave on a bit and we'll see how we go. As I was saying, sometimes I think it's unhelpful to hear about the love of God. Now, you might think that that's a bit strange thing for me to say, but because surely love is our thing. God is love. God so loved the world. Love your neighbour. Anything that matters is faith expressing itself through love, etc. But I wonder if we might have essentially, and with a problem, we've diluted the love of God, and uh, we've begun to treat the love of God like the community treats love. So when it happens that you disagree with somebody, there's this sort of freak out, and people think because you disagree with me, you hate me, and so they'll say things like, "Are you hating on me?" That sort of thing. I think that we've just lost the plot a little bit, and I think you'd probably agree in so many ways that this is the case. Um, uh, so yeah, I do wonder whether we might have diluted the love of God. It has become a bit bland. I have no stats for you, only a feeling that what we have done we've talked about the love of God, but we've failed to talk about the judgment of God. And I think that we need to see that judgment is a part. He is going to do the right thing, and he's going to make sure that the right thing is done, and that's actually the loving thing to do. So when we fail to talk about judgment, we fail to really express love, I suppose, in a lot of cases. So judgment has a practical and pastoral implication. So you can remember Jesus says the reason that we ought not judge is so that we too will not be judged. So he talks about the way that we judge others will be the way that we ourselves are judged. There's a bunch of parables about that as well. Um, Romans 14:10 says, uh, you then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Why do you treat them with contempt? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God." There we go. But 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10 also says exactly that. We will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And I think it's important for us to reiterate at this point that the judgment that we are facing is not a judgment for sin, because that judgment has been taken on the cross. Jesus has taken the penalty for sin, and uh, that is the good news of the gospel. The other good news of the gospel is that we get to live the righteous life that God desires. And I suppose one of the things that we've been hearing from James is that we need to speak and act. This is chapter 2 and verse 12. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. So I think it's good for us to see that the law that gives freedom is the law to love one another. And so there is, in some sense, the standard by which we will be judged. Have we used our resources and relationships for the purpose of loving others? So I think that's a good question for us. That is one of the ways that judgment is used as an incentive for the people of God to live lives that are pleasing to God. So in some sense, we could really stop there and say, right, well, there's areas in my life that I need to work on that. Now, I want to live to please God. I'm really working hard to see what that looks like, and so I want to say to you, as I say to myself, let's keep working hard at that. Let's keep thinking that through. That's not, however, the judgment that we're talking about tonight. The judgment that we're talking about tonight is the judgment to come, classic judgment to come. The Creed says it, doesn't it? That Jesus will come again in glory what to do, but to judge the living and the dead. Romans 2 says this will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ. 1 Peter chapter 4 says they are surprised, that is, those who don't understand why you've converted to Christ. They are surprised that you do not join with them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But then it goes on to say, but they will have to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So there is this judgment that the New Testament speaks about, yes, to the believer as an accountability for what they've been given and used, but there's also this judgment that is coming to those who will not take the name of Christ and be forgiven. I mean, if you refuse forgiveness, then you won't be forgiven. That makes sense, doesn't it? If you refuse to have Jesus take your judgment, then the only other option is for you to take your judgment. There's the great message of the gospel. It's interesting that in Acts chapter 10 and verse 42, Peter says, when he summarizes what Jesus left for them to preach, it was this. He said, he commanded us to preach to the people and testify that he is the one whom God appointed as judge of the living and the dead. So here's Peter saying, here is what we're meant to preach: judgment. We are meant to preach judgment. And it is simply not popular, as I imagine you would agree. However, to only preach the love of God without the judgment of God is actually to preach a diluted love. And I think that's my point so far. So there will be a judgment day. Now, what the reason that I've begun to talk about judgment is because this passage is thick with judgment. It's thick with not the first type of judgment where the believers will be held to an account for those relationships and resources that they've used or haven't used, whatever it might be. But this is the judgment that is coming on those who refuse to follow Jesus, who refuse to have their judgment taken. So it says there, chapter 5 and verse 1, now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. So it's my suggestion that this passage is not talking about rich Christians, and it's not even talking to rich Christians as such. It's talking to those those rich people in the society of the day who are oppressive and oppressing the rich. Oppressing the believers. Sorry, I got all the words mixed up then. So you remember back in James chapter 2 and verse 7, it talks about the rich as the ones who are slandering the noble name of him to whom you belong. So there is this attitude that is growing in the people in James, in the Christians that are spread across the nations. There's this attitude brewing that is leaning towards the rich and is leaning towards trying to find some comfort in this world via the wealth of this world. And so I think that is James is really trying to say to the believer, don't do that. Don't fall for the world. Don't love money. Be careful. And one of the reasons you need to be careful is because of the destiny of these rich oppressors. Now, I suppose I want to say that James is not speaking to the rich oppressors in their hearing. He's speaking to the rich oppressors in the hearing of the believers. So Jesus talks like this in Luke chapter 10. He speaks about, woe to you, Chorazin and Bethsaida, if the miracles done in you were done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented. And now those aren't lists, they aren't hearing. It is a message about another group for the purpose of another for the Christians overhearing. Ezekiel 29 talks about is Ezekiel preaching to Egypt, but they're not hearing it. It is a message about Egypt, but it is for the believers to hear. It's called prophetic lament. The oppressor is not expected to be hearing the words. The words are for the oppressed. And so, what does James say to the rich in the hearing of the oppressed? Well, he says, "Your wealth is rotted, moths have eaten your clothes, your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days." Now, the last days are the days just before what day? The judgment day. That's the days that precede the judgment day. And that is the day that we are in now. And believers need to see the joy of that day. So Proverbs will say, when justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers. Proverbs 21, verse 15, that is. When justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers. Well, of course it brings terror to evildoers because God is about to fix up the problem. And if you're the problem, God's about to fix you up. Now, if you're overhearing this about these ruthless, oppressive, rich people, you need to hear that God has got this sorted. He knows what's going on. He won't allow them to get away with it. So, verse 4 gives us a bit more information about these rich oppressors. It says, "Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." So the there is a great big damning, condemning charge coming from James towards the rich oppressors in the hearing of those that they are oppressing. And they're realizing, I would not want to be in their shoes. We're in the last days. The next day is Judgment Day, and you're living life like that. Well, I certainly do not want to envy you. And I suppose what that does, it's a loving thing to do for the oppressed person because it says to them, God has got your back. He is not going to let you down. He is going to make sure that those who are oppressive will be called to justice and judgment. And that's a good that is a good judgment. But that's when it's good to hear about judgment. That last verse, verse 6, says, "You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." Your one might have, "You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you." So I wonder if I can ask you a question. That's if I have anybody listening, because of all the problems that we had previous to this. I wonder if I can ask you a question. Who do you think the innocent one is? Who do you think the innocent one is? Um, Play some background music, some thinking music. Dun, 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 dun. Sorry, out of tune totally. Who do you think the innocent one is in verse 6? Jesus. Okay, so June has said Jesus, and it does really sound like Jesus, doesn't it? Because he was certainly the innocent one who was taken by Pilate. He had done nothing wrong, which was the cry. So I think, Graham says, I don't know. I think that, June, you are correct by saying that it is Jesus. But the fact that it is Jesus does not take away the fact that each person who is following Jesus, who is oppressed, that they become like Jesus. They're following in his footsteps in some sense. So I wonder if this is a way of James saying, uh, if you're being oppressed for doing the right thing, you're in good company, and that is in Jesus' company, the innocent man. That's my take on it. You may have another thought on it, but that's where I think it could be pushing towards. Well, I think overall we've seen that God will judge. There is a day of judgment coming. Romans chapter 12 says, "Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for the wrath of God." So we're not to get people back. We're not to to employ and a revenge strategy. Rather, the strategy we are to employ is mercy and leave that judgment to God. So NIV says innocent men, and I think that let's have a look at the footnote for that. Chapter 5, verse 6. Hebrews 10:38. So yes, that'll be talking about those who were suffering righteously. I think that the innocent men is actually singular in the Greek. It is innocent man. So I think that's why it's sort of pointing to Jesus, but at the same time, effectively saying that if this is going on for you, remember what happened to Jesus. You're in good company. He is with you on this. Okay, so now we're going to pause for a minute, and I'm going to float something with you. And this was much of what we had to say on Sunday, and I'm really trying to wrestle through this personally, and I'm not really sure how to go about it. So I'd be really keen to hear if you're able to help in any way. What James has effectively done here is spoken a lot like the prophets of old, who spoke against those who did not practice justice, who oppressed others. And there was a judgment call on them. They were called to account that they were facing by oppressing the poor. They were oppressing the Lord, because the Lord is the one who is for the poor. His ears are open to the poor's cry. And that's a problem if you're the rich and you're being cried against to the Lord, because the Lord's going to hear it. My question is for us. There is a bunch. I'm just trying to work out how to apply this passage, because there's a bunch of injustice in the world today. Are we just to say to those who are suffering injustice, look, don't worry, a judgment is coming. So you keep suffering, and just know that the judgment is coming. I feel uncomfortable with that. I feel uncomfortable with that. One, because it's true, and two, because it just seems to it gets me out of any sort of responsibility of care for those people who are suffering any sorts of injustice. So if I don't think in my particular tradition of Christianity, we have been all that good at being conscious of the injustices of the day and acted towards righting those. I think rather we have we've just simply not do it. And I think one of the things important is that James will say to us that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is to look after orphans and widows in their distress, to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now, I've got to ask the question, is he saying, well, you've got to look after all the Christian orphans and widows? Is it only the Christians that we are to look after? No. I just think, well, that doesn't really ring true to me. To love neighbour is to not only love Christian neighbour, but to love all our neighbours. I know of some Christian missionaries in Thailand, for example, who are looking after children with cerebral palsy, and because the throwing out, to put it harshly, of children in Thailand who have any sorts of things like that, like cerebral palsy, they feel free to throw them out, because they say, well, this is their karma. They've obviously done something in their life beforehand that makes them deserve to have this. So we're going to throw them out and feel okay about it. And so there are Christians in Thailand that are picking up unwanted kids with cerebral palsy and caring for them. And so they've got tens and 20s and 30s of these kids with cerebral palsy that they're helping. Now, I just I don't think that they only say, "Well, we'll only take in the Christian kids," or the whatever it might be. I think they've really got that sense of this is an injustice, and we need to move in the name of Christ to fix this injustice or work towards it. And I think that we ought to consider this. We ought to consider this as well. I have trouble with judgment coming somewhere between now and maybe several thousand years. Yes, that's right. Yes, so there is potentially a tremendous delay, and yes, it could be at least a lifetime. Let's bring it back from a few several thousand years. Uh, Everybody, I suppose, meets their judgment day at their death. I'm not sure how it all happens at death or after death. I know there will be a day of judgment. Um, in the meantime, I mean, it would be pretty scary to be conscious, to know that you're guilty, that you're not forgiven, and to be waiting consciously for the day of judgment. That's got to be pretty scary. That's got to be that's a hell of its own, isn't it? So, but I think my question is, um, the scriptures and scriptures like this, James 5, have so infiltrated and soaked into the fabric of society that Christians over the centuries have seen the need for proper care and justice to be done, and so things like, well, we know of William Wilberforce and the slave trade and his work in that, along with quite a few others. We think of a lot of Christian organisations that have actually begun with the purpose of having um, a real say and show a real concern for these sorts of matters. And I suppose it's difficult for me because the question is, how is that? How does that um, reflect for us as a church? It's a classic. I've already had a discussion with a group of people about it, and already uh, there became problems when we began to think about it because one person believes one thing's happening, another believes it's not happening. Someone might say, "Well, we could let's take sweatshops. That's far enough away from us for the moment. We could speak into that. We could try to rid the world of sweatshops, whatever it might be." Uh, but then others will say, "Well, no, those sweatshops are the only jobs those people have got." And it has been said that I've got to try and remember how it was said that the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. And so the idea there is for those in some countries that um, the only means of income is that which is the income that comes from being exploited. Uh, it becomes very complicated and very difficult. I did read one brief study that said, okay, well, let's test this. Let's go to Ethiopia. Let's go to a multinational that has created a sweatshop and was paying very low wages with no benefits. And it wasn't long before people actually pulled out and just started their own work. Went back to agriculture, and although it was paying less, they just said it was much better conditions. It was all sorts of things. It's difficult to um, we live in a very messy world, and I think this is a very difficult thing for us to wrestle with. I do, however, know that there are problems, and we do need to meet them in the name of Christ. We do need to say, what is it to love our neighbour? We know how to love our neighbour in our church. When someone at church is sick, we make them a meal. When someone at church is in need, even financial need, we put the hat around, we care for them. This is right and should happen, but we're really good at doing it for ourselves, but not for those on the outside. And it seems to me the Bible does say, do good to all people, especially the household of God. Now, the point is there, especially the household of God, yes, but not only the household of God is what it's also saying. So I think when it comes to social justice, we need to have some voice in the community, not as a way of endearing people to us, uh, but as a way of showing love to others. It is that showing of love to others that will endear people to us. It's not that we look at us, we feed the poor people, think we're good, come and join our church and give us your money. No, it's look at us. We're really trying to love. We're really trying to follow Jesus. If you want to follow Jesus too, then come along and be part of it. So uh, I think we are doing things as a church. And the missionaries we support also have a lot of social care in their particular environments. I just think we need to think through what that means in our particular environment and how that could happen. So yeah, that's some of the things that I've been thinking about there. I think overall, the reality that God will judge is a comfort for those who are feeling the oppression of the oppressor. And so I don't know if you've heard of this Jeffrey Epstein. I saw part of a program about him last night. Uh, like he has just done atrocious things to women, to young women, um, women less than 18, women over 18 as well. And now he has allegedly taken his own life in the jail cell. Now, I would want to say to those people who have been hurt by him, what he did was terrible and wrong, and that he will be facing God in judgment. So we need to find comfort in that judgment. We need to find comfort in the fact that there's an oppressor. The oppressed will be judged. So I think that we have a lot to think about. In the end, judgment is a good message. It is part of a fully orbed understanding of the love of God. His judgment is right because it would not be just or loving, would it? If you were walking along the street and you saw a little 4-year-old boy being beaten up by a man and you did nothing because you said, well, it's not loving to judge, you would not be loving, would you? The loving thing to do would be to take a judgment, to head in there and to deal as much as you can with that situation. So I think that those are the sorts of things I want to say. And really, that is everything I want to say tonight. Here is a passage that speaks about judgment. There are two types of judgment: the judgment that believers will face, which is a calling of accountability for that which they have had the opportunity to be their relationships and resources. And then there is another type of judgment, which is the key judgment day thing, which is the judgment that follows the last days, which we are in. If you have hoarded wealth in the last days and you have done that by oppressing others, then you have no hope. You have, James is really writing them off. And I think that we need to hear that there is a God who will do the right thing. So the application to us is in verse 7, be patient, therefore. So if you were one who was under that oppression of somebody else, then be patient. Be patient because the judgment is coming. Yes, so I think we want to leave it there. There we go. I don't know how long we've gone for because I don't know how long I talked in the first one. A little bit of a muck up then, wasn't there? So I apologise for that. But I really don't know what I could have done because I'm not sure what actually happened. It's so good to be with you. I really hope that it's valuable for us to sit and to hear these things on a Wednesday night. I find it helpful to go over them, and I pray that it will be helpful to you as well. I would hate it for you to just feel like you needed to be here. I really want you to be encouraged by all of this. Sandra Ross says, thank you, Nathan. The hope is of the Lord's justice, as some are most unjust. That's absolutely correct. A sure hope. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to head off and I will see you on the other side. See you later.